been years since Juanita Bynum last spoke out. The whole church world is shaking because of what she just said about Bishop T.D. Jake stepping down. This isn't just another goodbye. This matters to me. Some say it's been building for over 20 years, so you won't believe what she said. The Christian community was shocked when Bishop T.D. Jakes, one of the most important spiritual leaders of our time, said he was stepping down. What came after, though, got even more attention. A voice from the past that is strong and blunt. As a strong woman in her own right, Dr. Juanita Bynum finally spoke up. She had more to say than just about his leaving. It was about everything that came before it. We're going to look at the complicated past of Juanita Bynum and T.D. Jake in today's film. Between their early days on world stages and the stress that lingered below the surface, we'll talk about what really happened, what Juanita just said, and why this is more than just a retirement. It's time to make up. You'll learn what went wrong, what Juanita's message really meant on a spiritual and personal level, and why her words have brought up old issues that many people thought were closed off. Stay tuned, because this story takes a turn that no one saw coming, and by the end you'll see things in a whole new way. Pastor Bishop T.D. Jakes has been a star in the spiritual world for many years. His talks were very loud. His Woman Thou Art Loosed conferences changed people's lives, and his book sold millions of copies. He had a lot of faith and was a strong person who was full of grace, knowledge, and power. Juanita Bynum saw something else, though, behind the shiny lectures and big stages. Something that no one ever asked about. So Juanita Bynum wasn't just a bystander as Jake rose to fame. She was a part of the group. Many people think that Bishop Jake made her famous after she gave her powerful No More Sheets lecture at one of his big conferences. It was real. It was true. And it was just what a lot of women needed. But even though the cameras showed togetherness, there were rumors of tension going around behind the scenes. People who knew what was going on say that Juanita and Bishop Jake had very different ideas about service, responsibility, and the role of spiritual leaders. Jake thought it was important to keep up a certain image and be quiet about things that affected the public. Juanita Bynum, on the other hand, was always speaking her mind and thought the truth should never be hidden, even if it made people feel bad. Now this is where things get interesting. In private, Juanita is said to have talked about her worries about what she called the celebrity culture that was growing in the church. Big preachers who live like kings and queens. Huge conferences that felt more like fun than spiritual healing were given by congregations without any thought. Insiders say the strain was real, even though she never named Jake by name at the time. The world saw two giants walking together, but things were more complex than that. There was respect between them, but their ideals were becoming more and more different. When Bishop Jake said he was stepping down as leader, Juanita Bynum didn't say the usual nice things. She told the truth, or at least her truth. What did she say, though, and why did she say it now, after years of silence? Stay with me, because the next part will show you Juanita's raw words and what they say about the man who many people called America's pastor. As the years went by, Juanita Bynum's quiet about Bishop T.D. Jakes' leadership and eventual resignation became a heavy weight that she couldn't carry until she finally spoke out. That's when Juanita finally spoke up, and it wasn't just because Jake quit. They were a reflection of everything she had seen, done, and felt during their time in the public eye. What made Juanita's message so important, though, was that she didn't just say she was sad or shocked as many people thought she would. She wasn't here to put down or criticize. She instead brought something deeper to the table: clarity. Through an honest interview, Juanita began to show the spiritual kingdom in a way that many people had only seen from the outside. She spoke with passion and didn't shy away from talking about what really happens when success takes over your life. He said this as his main point. Too often people treat spiritual leaders like gods that can't be touched, and the stress of keeping up that image can kill the ministry's very soul. It became clear that Juanita wasn't just talking about Bishop Jake as the conversation went on. She was criticizing the whole system of celebrity-led ministries that often stray from their real purpose. She asked in a deep voice, people want to be inspired and healed. But what happens when the healing stops and the image takes over? At this point in the talk, it was clear how important what she said was. She wasn't just thinking about Jake's choice to step down as leader. She was calling into question the system that had made him and others like him invincible. What do you do when your ministry is more about the brand than the calling? Was the question she asked, and it hit like a hammer. This wasn't the shocking revelation that some had hoped for. There were not any shocking or explosive charges, but there was something even stronger, a criticism of a culture that put success over service. She said that this was why TD didn't surprise her. Jake's choice to step down. Juanita went on, people think they can do everything sometimes. But in the end the stress will break you. The weight of expectations and the loneliness of being a leader will wear you down. It wasn't just about TD Jake and her message. The message was for leaders in every area, but especially for those who are the spiritual core of a community. It can be suffocating to have so many people expecting them to be perfect and fighting silent fights that no one sees. What shocked me most wasn't what she said, but when she said it. Why did Juanita wait so long to speak up? Did she know long before anyone else that the crash was going to happen? Or did her choice to speak out have something to do with how her ministry, and her own, was changing? As the conversation went on, Juanita talked more about the sacrifices that many spiritual leaders have to make. They often put their own health and happiness at risk for fame, money, and attention. Jake's wasn't just about him giving up his job. It was the system that made him and a lot of other people feel like they had nowhere to go. But there was one last trick that no one saw coming. Just what was the real reason he chose to step down? Was it really because he was tired and needed a break, as he said in public? Or was there something else that no one had dared to say out loud yet? What Juanita Bynum said became even more important as the talk went on. What she said next shocked everyone who was there. And it wasn't about a scandal, an affair, or betrayal that was known to everyone. The story was about the painful truths that no one ever talks about. She took a moment to collect her thoughts before she shocked everyone with the news. Not only was she tired or under a lot of heat from the public, it was good for TD Jake to step down because the ministry had turned into a monster and he needed a break. For a moment both the interviewer and the people in the room couldn't say anything after Juanita's comment. Just what did she mean by that? Before you can understand how serious Juanita's words are, you need to know what Bishop Jake does for a living. Over the years his ministry had grown into a world empire that went far beyond the church walls. TD Jake wasn't just a preacher anymore. A brand, a public person, and a business mogul. He had a huge following in print, TV, and even movies. Juanita did say, though, that great power comes with great cost. Her view was that the kingdom that Jake had built could not last. It wasn't just being tired from being the center of attention. It was the huge amount of demands that made him feel down. There were expectations not just for him but for the whole mega-church system. Image is what the system was built on. Juanita said that it was based on this idea of beauty. And when you can't keep it up you break because the pressure is too high. But this wasn't just what she thought. It was the result of years of seeing other people in the ministry, including herself, deal with the same problem. She thought about how many times she had seen leaders, especially those who became famous quickly like Jake, get caught up in keeping up appearances instead of following their spiritual calling. What she meant was that the cost of trying to meet the public's high standards, the never-ending circle of being on camera, and the never-ending need for more, reached a dangerous breaking point. It wasn't just about service anymore, it was about getting through. This event hit Juanita right in the heart with her words. The things that were supposed to help leaders were taking over their lives. What Juanita said was more than just a criticism, though, it was a message. But the truth is that you lose sight of what's important when you're in a system that demands constant growth, attention, and exposure. Not only was she talking to Jake, but also to all the mega-churches and the leaders who had let their missions turn into business-like organizations. Why did TD Jake finally give up? Juanita's answer had many parts. He quit as TD Jake because the cost of the brand had become too much for him to handle. Juanita says that this moment of insight came after a long time of stress and burnout. Jake had built an empire that most people would only dream of, but it came with a constant need for improvement, growth, and development. At some point he had to ask himself, at what cost? Her next insight was even more important. It's not just being physically worn out. When you build something so big that it grows bigger than you, it changes you emotionally and spiritually. That wasn't just a comment on Jake's work. Other leaders who were going in the same direction should take note. Truth be told, a lot of leaders like Jake are surrounded by people who agree with them. These people don't often have anyone to remind them of reality. Because they don't want to lose their success or job, they may not make good decisions and stay in jobs or situations that may not serve them or their calling anymore. This was something Juanita already knew to be true. When she said you can't serve from an empty cup, she meant it. The mask always comes off in the end and the truth always comes out. But it got even stranger. The tipping point wasn't just Jake's own breaking point, it was also the pressure from the people around him. As Juanita looked into it more, it became clear that Jake's decision to step down was affected by pressures from outside sources. She thought that the politics, the rumors, and the power struggles going on behind closed doors were forces that couldn't be ignored. As she talked about the problems, she painted a picture of a man who had always tried to live up to what people thought of as a spiritual leader, even as those around him changed their own goals. Juanita's words showed that there are people in the church who care more about power and control than helping their communities. The last surprise she dropped was something no one saw coming. At this point you realize that the people closest to you may not have been there for the right reasons. She wasn't just talking about Jake's close friends and family, she was talking about the reality of church leadership at the highest levels. Juanita had now painted a scary picture of what many spiritual leaders have to deal with. A world where their love for ministry, their calling, and their sense of self can be sucked up by the machine they've built. What's next for T.D. Jake? As the conversation went deeper, Juanita Bynum started to think about the bigger picture, T.D. Jake's legacy, and what would happen after he left. Many people saw his ministry as the pinnacle of success, not just spiritually, but also in terms of power, wealth, and cultural influence. But as Juanita said, leaving a legacy isn't easy. The question now was, what will happen to T.D. Jake's legacy when the man himself steps down? Juanita wasn't shy about talking about how hard it is to leave a monumental legacy. Someone told me it was like a double-edged sword. A legacy is supposed to last after you're gone, but when it's built around your personality, your name, and your personal brand, it can be heavy. Jake's legacy was heavy not only because of how far he had come, but also because of how many people expected others to fill the void he would leave. Juanita went on, people don't realize that when a leader like Jake steps down, it affects everyone in the ecosystem around them. She wasn't just talking about Jake's millions of followers or the pastors and staff who worked with him. She was talking about the business world, the media, and the whole industry that had grown around his name. She agreed that T.D. Jake had built a multi-million-dollar empire that went beyond the pulpit. His megachurch in Dallas, the Potter's House, had become a cultural phenomenon. His books were bestsellers, his conferences drew thousands of people, and millions of people watched him on TV. His influence went beyond religion, but the question still stood: how does a legacy live on when it's so closely linked to one person? Juanita's view was based on truth, and it was clear that she thought a true legacy shouldn't be built on one person's persona, but on the core values of the ministry and the people who carry that vision forward. But Juanita then asked the most haunting question: could T.D. Jake's legacy live on if it was so tied to his brand image and identity? This was the cliffhanger that left many people wondering if there was hope for what Jake had built, or if it would just become another story of a great leader who couldn't escape the weight of his own success. It was then time to talk about how Jake's decision would affect his church and the Christian community as a whole in the long term. When a figure like T.D. Jake steps down, it shakes the very foundation of the system, she said, adding that it wasn't just about his own ministry but about the culture of megachurches and ministry empires that had become the norm in the last few decades. There was still a lot of uncertainty about who would take over next. Who could replace a leader who had built such a huge platform? Juanita said that Jake's departure would leave a big hole that would be hard to fill. Other pastors, leaders, and influential people would have to work harder to lead and keep things the same. But this is where things got interesting. The world is changing, and so is the church. Juanita didn't hide the fact that the megachurch model was being closely looked at. As society changes and people's expectations of faith and ministry change, the need for flashy, star-driven leadership was starting to fade. She said that big buildings and fancy events weren't the only things that made the church what it was. A new generation of leaders wasn't interested in the leader's brand but in the ministry itself. She gave examples of leaders who were focusing on being real, trustworthy, and connected with their congregations. Leaders who are rooted in the truth of helping others and not just promoting themselves. This is the future, Juanita said with confidence. It's true that Jake has built something amazing, but the future of the church isn't just about continuing to grow, it's about going to where people are. It was clear what she meant. No matter how successful TD Jake was, he was from a different time when the church worked differently. The people who could change with the times and meet the needs of the world would be the ones who would have the most success in the future. She did say, though, that there was a lot of doubt about what that change would look like. Jake's decision to step down would have effects on his ministry and the megachurch business as a whole for years to come. A new beginning for TD Jake, a chance to repent or run away. Then the question that everyone was thinking about came up. How will things go from here for TD Jakes? Juanita had an interesting take on this. She said that a lot of church leaders don't really leave something. They switch to new projects or jobs instead. She said that TD Jake had too much power to just leave. She said he may step down from one role, but I have no doubt he'll find a way to reinvent himself. She also said that Jake's next move would probably be just as planned as everything else he had done. It wasn't just a guess that TD Jake might be able to change himself. There were already a lot of people who were thinking about it. Juanita really thought that Jake could change his legacy in a way that goes beyond the public picture of a megachurch pastor. She was sure that his story wasn't over yet, whether it was through new media, speaking events, or something else. But the million-dollar question was still there. Would he be as good in his future projects as he was in the past? Would he be able to change with the times? Or would his public image be too tied to his past self for him to be able to truly remake himself? As Juanita spoke more, her words became a sobering comment on what changes in church leadership mean for the whole church world. There had been a lot of talk about TD Jake's leaving and his personal impact, but Juanita said that the bigger conversation wasn't just about Jake. The talk was about how leadership in the church was changing, especially among African Americans. Juanita's research was more than just looking at one person. If the church's leaders we've trusted for decades start to step down, what will happen? She cared about more than just Jake. It was about the departments that had grown up after he left. She said that for many young church-going people today, TD Jake and other megachurch leaders were what faith was all about. She stressed that charisma or stage appearance were no longer the only things that made someone a good church leader. Being real and having emotional understanding were becoming very important. A lot of these leaders had learned how to work with standard hierarchical systems, but a new generation was starting to think more deeply about things. Juanita talked about how people in the church are being asked to be more accountable. With the rise of social media, people could see their pastors and other leaders in a more human way. It got both support and attention on these sites. Juanita also saw that the way the church needed to be led had changed. Pastors were no longer just the faces of faith. They had to be open and take responsibility. And even though things are changing, Juanita knew it would be hard to lead in a new age. She talked about the old guard or pastors and leaders who had helped shape the church's history. In many places their ways of leading were still common. But Juanita thought the question wasn't just who would take their place, but also how the church would change to better meet the needs of the new group of Christians.